Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. In the lead up to the 10th Festival of Dangerous Ideas program announced, we will be releasing a collection of 10 speakers from across the 10 years of the festival, a decade of danger. Sign up at festivalofdangerousideas.com to hear what we have lined up for 2020. GDP. Those three little letters are responsible for guiding much of our political, economic and social decision-making in the 21st century. Is it time we reconsider its value? This is the centrepiece of the 2013 talk by environmental activist and ecofeminist Vandana Shiva. Her talk is both comprehensive and controversial, and it remains so today as growth and prosperity has continued to shape her homeland of India, as well as the physical and social world around us. It is important to remember that dangerous ideas can and should reframe the way we consider binaries of growth and poverty. Here's Vandana Shiva with Growth Equals Poverty.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Simran. We are repeatedly told by every politician in every country that we've got to have more growth to remove poverty. And the metaphor is the cake must get bigger for people to have a bigger share, especially the poorest. I'm not an economist, and that's why I can look at GDP and growth from the outside, from where it hurts nature, ecosystems, local communities. And it's at that level that our models of growth, which are driving not just our economic paradigm, but the paradigm of how society should be, is creating poverty at so many levels. The first poverty, I feel, is at the level of the mind, that humanity could have shrunk its mind so deeply and reduced the amazing pluralism of options we had of how to govern our affairs, how to produce and how to consume, and reduce it to one number, the GDP, the gross domestic product. And the poverty of the mind also in the ability to take an abstract number and allow it to have the power to destroy everything that is real, that sustains us, that sustains our ecological life, life in nature, as well as our social life. The problem with abstract numbers, and I was just telling Simran before coming in, she was asking, have I always loved to speak? I said, no, I used to refuse to speak. I was the head girl of my school, and they used to make me take assembly. I said, I won't. I hate to speak. And they wanted me to write essays. I said, why should I write essays when I can say the same thing in 5 lines of an equation? And I was among those who really believed, the abstract is beautiful, but the abstract is fine because you just play mind games, as I did with my quantum theory. But when the abstract starts becoming the measure for the real world and for life, that's when the destructiveness starts. Because every abstract that relates to living systems must have a feedback, must check, how is this measure working? Is it delivering on what I said would happen, or is it failing? The problem with GDP as an abstract number is it insulates itself from feedback. And no matter what scale of destruction takes place, there is no way to feed it back in. I know there's some rough calculations that actually if you take China's growth and India's growth and add the destruction of our rivers, just our water bodies and our rivers because of pollution, we would be having a negative growth, just that pollution isn't counted. How have we reached the place that we can sacrifice our world, our knowledge, for a flawed abstraction? Even the economist, which has celebrated the GDP, had to conclude in a debate it had at, I think, 2010, that GDP is a poor measure of improving living standards. And they're still talking of living standards. I don't think there's anything like a living standards. There's well-being. There's ways of life. But there isn't a standard which you can say everyone can and should reach. And GDP has definitely not improved well-being. But it's not just a number, as I said. It's not just a number for measuring economic growth. It's a model of society. And it's a model that justifies the destruction of all social cohesion, all social justice, every aspect of our lives that makes for livable lives. And it does it all in the name of this very gross number. Gross in the sense of gross. Gross because it has generated more bads than it has generated goods. It has perpetuated a model of generating non-sustainability, inequality, and a deep violence within society and within the self. But GDP as a measure of the economy was created during the war. It is part of the war machine. It is what helped America win the war at least as much as the development of the nuclear bomb carried out by the Manhattan Project. And GDP has been called the Manhattan Project of economics. And the way this was done was by creating a very artificial boundary. This production boundary, totally imaginary, said, if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. Interesting, isn't it? That means the amazing hydrological cycle of nature doesn't produce any water. Water gets produced the day a Coca-Cola comes in and starts drilling for 1.5 million liters, and miraculously, there's growth. Water in plastic bottles, 12 rupees in India, I don't know how much out here. And as my experiences have taught me, experiences where ordinary women from villages would have to start walking 10 miles for water and wanted to shut down these Coca-Cola plants, that's when I realized what that bottled drinking water was. I've never liked the brown liquid anyway, you know. Way before I knew what they put into it, just the taste for me was foul. But even water in a bottle, for every liter in the bottle, there's 10 liters of destruction. The level of mining of groundwater is amazing. And what's left behind is heavy metals of a very, very high level, lead, arsenic. Now, we've done studies around every Coca-Cola plant in India. And the groundwater won't have these heavy metals, but the groundwater around Coca-Cola will. Of course, everything about their production is a trade secret. So they don't tell you how these heavy metals are coming into the water. So between the water level going down because of heavy extraction and what remains getting polluted with heavy metals, there's no drinking water left. In abundant regions, there's a water famine. And the most important case in this was a village called Platimada in Kerala. Where it must have been 2002, and I get an invitation from a community I don't know to say, come and celebrate 1 year of our fighting Coca-Cola with us. So I trotted off out of sheer inquisitiveness. You know, how could Coca-Cola be damaging the environment? And I learned everything. And when I was going back, I asked my Lama, who was leading the campaign, I said, my Lama, what do you want me to tell them when I get back to Delhi? And she just said, tell them when they drink Coke, they drink the blood of my people. And I can tell you, I haven't been able to touch a bottle of Coke even if I'm dying of thirst, or a Kinley, or a Dasani. They have different names in different parts of the world. Everything that generates growth is creating poverty in ecosystems because of that strange definition that if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. Now, nature produces and consumes in amazing cycles of nutrients, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the cycles that keep this earth alive. But this regeneration is treated as non-production because the idea of GDP is how to extract the wealth from nature and society, and at that time to mobilize funds for the war, to buy all the armaments, to finance all the war research, and more importantly, to deploy all the military all around the world. Sadly, that war machine continues to be the model of our economy. And the idea that nature doesn't produce, people don't produce if they produce for themselves. If you cook a wonderful meal at home, you don't produce. It doesn't contribute to the GDP. You go eat a McDonald's hamburger, you're contributing to the GDP. And then you're contributing extra because then you get obesity and then you get all the things that come with that hamburger. And it's a perpetual growth economy. There's a very powerful way in which in 1968, Bobby Kennedy, in his campaign, this was around the time of the Vietnam War, and he had started to criticize the growth measure. At that time it used to be called GNP, now it's called GDP, because then they used to measure what a country produces no matter where. Now they measure what is produced in a country no matter by whom, because we are in a period of globalization. So no matter who the investor, it'll count in Australia's GDP, even though all the returns go right out. That's not counted. So Bobby Kennedy had said, too much and for too long, we have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. GNP counts air pollution and cigarette advertising, ambulances and clearing our highways of carnage. It counts special locks on our doors and the jails for the people who broke them. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm and counts nuclear warhead and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit or our courage, neither our wisdom or our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And if you look at different countries, whether it was the US in the time when they were really having growth, especially the period from the 1960s to the 1970s, their GDP tripled. Yet during these same 30 years, there was a 560% increase in violent crime, a 419% rise in illegitimate birth, a quadrupling of divorce rates, a tripling of the percentage of children living in single-parent homes, 200% increase in teenage suicide. And in India, which for the last decade was called emerging. Now, obviously an ancient civilization like ours can't emerge. But what was emerging was the GDP, because suddenly GDP was guiding how our economic policy was shaped, but how our society was shaped. And we had started to hit 9%, and everyone was saying, oh, we're going to go to the double digit. And now it's collapsed to 3.8%, which was the rate before all this effort to destroy the economy was made. But in this period of globalization and the chasing of the illusion of growth, we've managed to push every fourth Indian to hunger, every second child so malnourished that they are wasted and stunted. Malnutrition indicators, stunted means their height is too low, they're becoming dwarfs. And wasted means their body weight is so low that they'll never ever grow up fully, physically or psychologically. It's in the same period as our seed sector was liberalized, as is so called, and started to get monopolized by a handful of companies, including my favorite one, Monsanto, in the cotton area. Farmers have got into debt because growth measures how much profits get made in the seed sector. No profits were made as long as the seed was renewable, was in the hands of the farmer, could be saved for the next season. It was a zero-cost economy, but it was huge growth in terms of replenishment of life. The family of crops that are called millets have their name, millet, from a million, because each seed gives rise to 1,000,000 seeds. And what can compare in abundance with the multiplication factor of 1,000,000 with each generation of planting? You can save a quarter, eat 50%, and still have enough to sell a bit to then pay for your education, your health, your clothing. The entire effort of the seed industry, starting with getting into the World Trade Organization rules for intellectual property, is an attempt to prevent seed from reproducing itself. If you produce what you consume, you don't produce. So seed becomes raw material, and this amazing language of laws that is entering. Seed has just disappeared from the discussion. The new language talks of plant propagating material. It talks of the seeds of the farmers, heritage seeds, as pre-basic. 10,000 years of evolution is kindergarten. It's pre-basic. And what's basic is when the corporations take the seed, shoot a gene, a toxic gene usually, Roundup Ready or BT, and patent the seed, which is what the intellectual property rights of WTO were about. And Monsanto is on record saying, in writing this agreement, we were the patient, the diagnostician, and the physician all in one. We defined a problem, and for them the problem was farmers save seeds. And they offered a solution. It should now be treated as an intellectual property crime. I could give you example on example of what this has led to. But one consequence is farmers getting into debt because the seed cost jumped 8,000%, and half of that is royalty that goes straight to the Monsanto headquarters. Every seed company today is licensed with Monsanto. There is no independent seed supply. So the only seed in the market is the patented one, the genetically modified one, and farmers can only get it through debt. And debt is what's pushing them to suicide. That is, in the final analysis, the highest level in which poverty is created, where annihilation of life itself becomes a consequence for chasing growth. But the abstract number is abstract only at one level. It has around it all kinds of privileges, all kinds of groups that benefit hugely from keeping a mentality of war alive in order to privatize and appropriate the resources that are shared by all life on earth and all communities for their welfare and their well-being. And this privatization of resources, of course, leads to growth. Because if a forest is renewing itself, if a forest is managing the catchments, there's no growth. You chop it down, turn it into timber, you get growth. But that growth creates the bads of the landslides, of the droughts, of the floods. And it was ordinary illiterate women of my region in the 1970s who started to say, we've got to stop the destruction of our forests. They were laughed at. And I remember a particular action of the Chipko movement. Chipko means to hug, to embrace. And the women said, we're going to hug the trees. You'll have to kill us before you cut the tree. And these actions went on in village after village, and the loggers would come to one village, and then they couldn't cut the trees, so they'd have to move to the next and the next. And it was amazing. There was no cell phone. There was no mobile. There wasn't even video cameras in those days. I remember I gifted the first camera to the movement to at least start recording some of the actions. And yet, the messages would reach, and the messages reached through beautiful songs, folk songs that were created in that time. And there was a particular action in 1977 where the women came out with lanterns, and the police was there to arrest them because they were interfering in revenue collection and growth. And they laughed and said, why are you carrying lanterns? Don't you see the sun is out? And the women said, we're not carrying the lanterns for the sun, we're carrying them for you. Because you don't seem to realize that the first product of the forest is not timber or revenue or resin. Resin from the pine trees that is used in all kinds of industrial products. They said the real products of the forest are soil, water, and pure air. In 1978, we had a massive devastation. An entire mountain slipped into the Ganges River above Uttarkashi, created a 4-mile-long lake, and when it burst, it created floods all the way to Calcutta. That's when the government, paying out for flood relief, realized what the women were saying had something to it. That the revenues the government was collecting from killing the trees and generating growth was nothing compared to what they had to pay for in terms of the destruction of flood. We still have a government that is responsible for flood relief and drought relief. For example, we've had a horrible cyclone in Orissa just now. The last time we had it in 1999, a super cyclone, 30,000 people died. This time only 1,000 died because the government was prepared, it evacuated people. Of course, they haven't been able to avoid the destruction of the rice fields and the coastal areas and the death of the animals, but life, at least, of human beings was avoided. Now, cyclones like the cyclone Phelan or the disaster in my region in Uttarakhand this year, I come from the central Himalaya where the Ganges starts, and that's where I've learned all my ecology, that's where I've learned all my lessons from nature and local communities. I have never seen the kind of devastation we had this year, where 2 days of intensive rain, the melting of a glacier and the bursting of a glacial lake led to the death of 20,000 people, and in certain areas, the destruction hasn't stopped. The mountains are still slipping. Because in our parts of the world, a flood is not just a level flood. A flood is taking the mountains down with it. This is an externality, a bad, of all the growth that's coming from your mining coal, from Canada having the tar sands. There's huge growth. Just 2 brothers called the Koch brothers, just through one pipeline, are going to make $100 billion. And these same brothers are the ones who financed the Tea Party, who financed the standoff in the Congress so that nothing worked for a while. I remember in 2009, we had a very severe drought in northern India. But in southern India, in the dry areas, in the arid areas, we had severe flooding. Just in that 1 year, the losses were about $40 billion. $40 billion is the entire commitment for a decade made by the historic polluters, the rich countries of the world, who through their growth based on fossil fuels have left us with the legacy of climate instability. Climate instability shows up in intensive floods, intensive droughts, and more frequent and more intensive cyclones. And the destruction that we are witnessing is growing by the day. Growth didn't take that into account and cannot. And if it did, it would have to stop. It would have to turn its attention to reducing emissions. Our priority would become creating resilience. Our priority would become shifting to activities that don't contribute. Now, there's been, for those who are growth fundamentalists, they mix up two things very conveniently. They mix up the growth of money and the growth of life. Trees growing, children growing healthy, that is growth of life. Societies thriving, rich culture, you're being here for dangerous ideas. Your mind is growing, hopefully. But growth as the multiplication of money, which was the original intention to mobilize for the war, has two additional problems in our times. The first big problem is now you can make money out of nothing. Just gamble on the casino. In fact, the global economy has become a global casino. The 2008 collapse was a result of that gambling. We have $3 trillion of finances moving around the world, 70 times more than all the goods and services available on the planet. Now that 70-fold more money in some people's hands is very hungry money. That's the money that then has to invest in real things. It has to invest in land, and if not by ethical means, unethical means through the land grab. It has to invest in water. That's why we see privatization of water. It has to invest in all our public services, the commons, the health systems, our education systems. And that's why you see in both at the level of domestic macroeconomic policy as well as international free trade policy, the heart of economic growth today is privatization of public systems. A modern enclosures of the commons that ensure that everyone has access to health, to education, to homes, to shelter, to citizenship, to food, to water. Now, I spent a lot of time looking at agriculture. And agriculture is very interesting in the way this growth idea has transformed it into a non-food system. We really have a poverty in food now. How does that poverty in food work? If GDP was one legacy of the war, chemicals for warfare were the second legacy of the war. And these chemicals were then brought into agriculture as agrochemicals. Fertilizers, pesticides. Of course, they led to huge amounts of growth in terms of their sales. And the wonderful thing is they are what I call ecological narcotics. The more you use them, the more you must use them. So the more you spray a pesticide, the more you've got to spray pesticides. And you've got a perpetual growth model built into the failure of the technology as fertilizer to create soil fertility or as pesticides to deal with controlling pests. The criteria that was evolved to measure growth in agriculture is something called the high-yielding variety, which only measures what leaves the farm. It doesn't measure the health of the soil, the health of the pollinators, the health of the plants, the health of the animals, the health of the farming family. Now, it just measures how much soya bean left, how much canola left, how much rice left, how much wheat left. So we get impoverished soils and impoverished farming families who have borrowed more to produce than what they can earn out of the production. Costs of production have gone up 10 times. And meantime, usually in agriculture, the price of what a farmer produces actually dropped since globalization. If you do your analysis for Australia, you'll find the same. I know for most agricultural crops, it is the case in India. The result is indebted farmers, farmers leaving the land. 15 million farmers have been forced out of agriculture in India in this period of the neoliberal economies taking over. It also means more hunger. Now, growth in agriculture is constantly talked about as solving the problem of hunger. That's why we must have GMOs. That's why we must have seed monopolies. After all, these corporations bring us food. We've been accused of killing people by questioning the inadequacy of the genetically engineered golden rice, which has 80 patents associated with it, for solving the problem of vitamin A deficiency leading to blindness. Now, the reason we think it's inadequate is because it's 7,000% less efficient in giving you vitamin A than the hundreds of alternatives we have in terms of our coriander and our curry patta and all the greens and all the yellows and all the carrots and all the pumpkins that are available. 7,000% more available in biodiversity. And yet, that shrunken mind wants to look at rice, patented genetically modified rice, and provide more vitamin A. If you look at the data on agriculture statistics, today, 72% of the food comes from small farms, from not the large industrial farms. 72%. So what should we be doing? Growing small farms and growing more on small farms. The Navdanya movement that I started in 1987 to save seeds, promote organic farming and fair trade, we did a study last year on the ecological farms where we protect biodiversity. And our study where we measured nutrition, which is what we should be measuring when we are doing food, it's called health per acre, we can feed 2 Indias by conserving biodiversity. We're always made to believe in the growth fundamentalism that you've got to wipe out other species so that humanity can have more food. The reality is, the more we leave for other species, the more we have ourselves. The more pollinators there are, the more food they give us. The more soil organisms there are, the more food they give us. The more biodiversity intensive an agriculture is and our gardens are, the more food per acre we get. But this is growth in life, in nutrition, in livelihoods, in creativity. And that is the contest we have right now. The contest between a killing GDP, an anti-life GDP, and indicators that would nourish life of all species and humanity. I'm very privileged not just to be part of this amazing movement of ecological agriculture and biodiversity conservation. I'm very privileged to be part of the movement to go beyond GDP. The King of Bhutan, about 30 years ago, maybe even longer, said they would not follow the growth model. They would not chase GDP. They would create gross national happiness. That creating the happiness of the citizens of Bhutan was the first objective. And they created parameters. Their planning commission is called the Happiness Commission. And 2 years ago, the then Prime Minister said, I cannot see any other way of growing happiness than growing organic. And so he invited me and Navdanya to help them make a transition to 100% organic Bhutan. So the farmers from India go twice a year, and the farmers from Bhutan come to us, to our farm, where we have a training center, and we offer courses, and we offer a wonderful month-long course called the A to Z of agroecology and organic farming, and a course on Gandhi's ideas of Swadeshi, of self-making. Because another aspect of the GDP and the definition of if you produce, if you consume what you produce, you don't produce, means that all of us are expected to be consumers. And consumerism as the current cult becomes the way in which this growth machinery keeps going after the war. If young men were mobilized through the GDP in the earlier days to march for wars, today they are marching to the malls. They're marching to shop, and young women. That's become the biggest pastime. And that is consuming the world. The word consumption was the word for TB in the Middle Ages. You died of it. And if we don't go beyond consumption, for sure humanity is not going to do too well. So we have a rogue concept, GDP, creating rogue economies, and they need to be brought back under control, under social control and under the control of ecological limits. As we question GDP and we create alternatives that might have low generation of financial wealth for a few, but a lot of abundance for all of life in its diversity and a lot of well-being for people, we are taking on the challenge of going beyond money-making as the measure of wealth-making. Aristotle had a very clear definition. He called money-making the chromatistics, the art of making money. Oikonomia for him was the art of living. And in today's context, the art of living has to be the art of living on a planet with limits. It's a hugely sophisticated art, very creative art. And the transition we must make is from the dumb implementation of a dumb number that is destroying life to the creative search for creating living economies, living democracies, and living cultures. I have called this Earth democracy. That's the project we cannot afford to postpone for too long. Thank you.
This talk was recorded at the Sydney Opera House in 2013 and was presented by the Sydney Opera House and the Ethics Centre.